Back in the 1930s, as the whole world was basically catching fire and sliding towards war, America was dead set on looking the other way. The country was still reeling from World War I, it was crippled by the Great Depression, and it literally built this fortress of neutrality around itself. But in just a few, incredibly short years, that fortress would start to crumble. And not because of one single attack, but because of a slow, careful series of choices that completely changed America's place in the world. So how on earth did that happen? Let's get into it.
Right. So this is the big question we're digging into. It's a fascinating story, really. It's full of political chess moves, economic pressures, and a president who was trying to very carefully steer a very reluctant nation toward a new reality as a global power. And what's key is that this huge transformation, it happened way before the first shots were fired at Pearl Harbor. I mean, this timeline really shows you the incredible speed of this shift. Just look at the pace. We start in 1935 with this super rigid, totally hands-off policy. Then just 2 years later, a little crack appears. But then, bam, by 1941, America isn't just arming the Allies, it's actually co-writing the blueprint for the entire post-war world. So let's break down how we got there step by step. Okay, so to really understand this journey, we have to start with the mindset. Back in the mid-1930s, the mood in America was overwhelmingly isolationist. I mean, the country was focused on its own massive problems at home and wanted absolutely nothing to do with the conflicts that were starting to brew in Europe and Asia. So what are we really talking about when we say isolationism? Well, in this context, it's the core belief that America's best interests are served by just staying out of everybody else's business. And this wasn't some fringe idea, It was the dominant political philosophy of the time, and it shaped everything from public opinion to actual federal law. So why? Why were they so determined to stay out? Well, there were some really powerful forces at play. First off, the Great Depression. With millions of people out of work, problems overseas just seemed, well, overseas, and not that important. Then you've got the ghost of World War I, this really painful memory of a war a lot of people felt America should never have gotten into in the first place. That suspicion got a huge boost from something called the WWII Committee, which basically suggested that bankers and arms dealers, the so-called merchants of death, had dragged the U.S. into that war just to make a profit. And you can see the result right there in that poll. 71%. A huge majority of the country was against getting involved in another foreign war. And this public mood wasn't just a feeling. It was written directly into law. The first couple of neutrality acts were incredibly strict. They forced a mandatory, automatic ban on selling weapons or giving loans to any country at war. It didn't matter who started it, who was the good guy, who was the bad guy. For a president like Roosevelt, who wanted a more flexible foreign policy, his hands were completely tied. But by 1937, things were starting to shift a little bit. The Spanish Civil War had shown some real problems with the existing laws, and Congress was starting to realize that a total ban on trade could actually hurt America's own fragile economic recovery. And all this led to a really important compromise, a new policy that started to poke the first hole in that armor of American neutrality. And this was it, cash and carry. The name pretty much says it all. The idea was pretty simple. America could sell non-military stuff to any nation at war, but there were two big catches. First, you had to pay in cash, right up front, no IOUs. And second, you had to carry it away on your own ships. The whole point was to keep American money and American ships out of the danger zone. Now, this might seem like a really small change, but it was actually a huge shift. The old policy was mandatory. The president had no choice in the matter. The new policy gave the president discretion. He could decide when to apply the rules. For the very first time, an internationally minded president had a tool, a lever he could pull to influence what was happening in the world without having to send troops. It was a major concession from the isolationists in Congress. And this quote just perfectly captures the hard-nosed, practical vibe of the whole thing. The statesman Bernard Baruch, who helped come up with it, put it so bluntly. It's a policy that basically says, yeah, we're open for business, but the risk, that's all on you. This was America trying to have its cake and eat it too, to be in the world economically, but stay out of it politically. So this new kind of experimental policy wasn't just going to sit on a shelf. It didn't take long at all. Just a few months after the 1937 Act was passed, a crisis blew up in Asia that would push the limits of American neutrality and force President Roosevelt to make a really game-changing call. In July of '37, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. I mean, for all practical purposes, it was a war, a brutal one. But here's the twist. Neither side ever formally declared war.
And that little detail created this legal loophole in the Neutrality Act, which was written to kick in only when a state of war officially existed. So this put President Roosevelt in a really tough spot. The law gave him the power to decide if a state of war existed. So what do? Do you invoke the act and treat it like a war, or do you use the loophole and pretend it's not officially happening? Let's just break down the stakes here, because they were huge. If Roosevelt invoked the Neutrality Act, it would cut off weapons to both sides. But that would be devastating for China, which absolutely depended on American imports. Meanwhile, it would barely affect Japan, which was pretty much self-sufficient and had a powerful navy. So in reality, invoking the act would have been a pro-Japan move. But not invoking it meant openly letting supplies flow to China, which would obviously make Japan furious. No matter what he did, that illusion of being impartial was about to be shattered. Roosevelt made his choice. He did not invoke the Neutrality Act. He used that legal loophole to keep aid flowing to China. And that decision, right there, marked the quiet beginning of America's undeclared war against the Axis powers. It was a subtle but very firm decision to pick a side. And you can see this had a real effect back home. Take a look at this shift in the polls. In October of '37, Roosevelt gave his famous quarantine speech, where he warned that this disease of lawlessness was spreading. And look what happens. In just 2 months after that one speech, public sympathy for China jumps a lot. The president was leading, and slowly but surely, the public was starting to follow. But let's be super clear here. This was not an easy path. This move away from isolationism kicked off a huge backlash. You had powerful groups like the America First Committee with famous spokespeople like Charles Lindbergh, arguing really passionately that Roosevelt was dragging the country into a war that wasn't its problem. The debate over America's role in the world was absolutely raging. By 1941, Britain was standing almost completely alone against Nazi Germany, and Roosevelt took the final, most decisive step. The Lend-Lease Act basically threw the cash part of cash and carry right out the window. It let the U.S. lend or lease war supplies to any country that was considered vital to the defense of the United States. And that was it. America was now, in Roosevelt's own famous words, the arsenal of democracy. Neutrality was over in everything but name. So now that America was committed to supplying the Allies, Roosevelt did something even more incredible. He arranged a meeting with the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, not just to talk about winning the war, but to actually define the kind of world that would come after it. Just try to picture the scene. It's August 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor. An American cruiser and a British battleship meet secretly in this foggy bay off the coast of Newfoundland. And on board are the two most powerful democratic leaders in the world, literally charting a course for the future while America was still officially at peace. It's like something out of a spy novel. And what came out of that meeting was the Atlantic Charter. Now, this wasn't a treaty. It was a joint declaration of principles. And just look at them. No territorial gains, self-determination for all people, lower trade barriers, global cooperation, freedom of the seas. I mean, this was a revolutionary vision for a world built not on conquest and empire, but on freedom and working together. And this wasn't just talk. The Atlantic Charter directly inspired the 1942 Declaration by United Nations, where 26 allied countries all pledged to uphold these same principles. And that declaration? It was the seed from which the modern United Nations actually grew. So many of the core ideas of the world we live in now, from the UN to global trade agreements, were born in that secret meeting at sea. So that's where we'll end it. In less than a decade, America went from a nation that wanted nothing to do with the world's problems to becoming the main architect of a whole new global system. The Atlantic Charter was this unbelievably optimistic vision for a peaceful world, and it was written in the absolute darkest days of the war. Which of course leads to the final question we should all think about. Nearly a century later, how much of that ambitious vision has actually been realized, and how much of it still shapes the world we live in today?